Sometimes the hardest relationships to grieve are the ones that never actually ended. The grief of sitting across from someone you've known for years and realizing the conversation no longer reaches you the way it used to. Nothing happened, but somewhere along the way, you changed. And now every time you're around them, you feel the distance quietly sitting between you. You didn't lose them. You just no longer fit together the same way. And somehow, that hurts more. This doesn't happen the way people imagine. It's usually not a fight, not some dramatic falling out. No final conversation that clearly explains everything. It's quieter than that. It's sitting across from someone you love and realizing the conversation suddenly feels thin. Not because they changed, because somewhere along the way, you did. It's laughing at the same joke you've heard for years and noticing it no longer reaches you the same way. It's slowly realizing that the version of yourself who fits so easily into certain rooms doesn't fully exist anymore. And the hardest part isn't that you stopped caring about them. It's that you started becoming more honest with yourself. And that changed the shape of almost every relationship around you. Sometimes there isn't a single moment where you notice this happening, just a growing feeling that the room you once fit inside has quietly become too small for you. Here's the part nobody really prepares you for: the guilt. Because when people in relationships start feeling different, it doesn't always feel like progress. Sometimes it just feels sad. These are people who knew you before you understood yourself. People who remember the version of you who stayed quiet, who never needed space, who fit naturally into the life you had back then. And maybe that's what makes this kind of distance so difficult to explain. Because often, nobody really did anything wrong. They still care about you. They still speak to you with the same warmth they always did. But somewhere along the way, something quietly stopped fitting the same way it used to. And when that happens, a part of you starts wondering if maybe the change is your fault. Maybe you've become too serious, too distant, too difficult to reach. Maybe this isn't change at all. Maybe you're just slowly isolating yourself. But transition and isolation only look similar from the outside. One disconnects you from people, the other reconnects you with parts of yourself. And sometimes that changes the shape of almost every relationship around you. If any part of this feels quietly familiar, it's probably because these feelings are more common than most people know how to talk about. And maybe that's why spaces like this matter. So if these essays help you feel a little more understood, I'm glad you found your way here. There's a loneliness that comes with becoming different from the version of yourself people grew used to. And nobody really prepares you for that part. Because sometimes the distance isn't caused by anger. Sometimes it's caused by subtle changes that nobody knows how to talk about. You begin needing more space, more honesty, more silence, more time away from things that once felt normal to you. And slowly, the relationships around you begin shifting shape, not always dramatically. Sometimes it's just the feeling that the version of you they knew no longer fully exists. And the hardest part is that the people you're drifting away from are not always bad people. Sometimes they still love you deeply, which almost makes the guilt heavier. Because now there's no obvious reason for the distance, just the quiet realization that returning to who you used to be would require abandoning parts of yourself you fought very hard to finally hear. And this is where the grief becomes difficult to explain. Because how do you tell someone, I still care about you, but I no longer know how to be the person I was when we met? So instead, you carry it quietly. The strange loneliness of becoming someone who no longer fully fits inside places that once felt like home. And maybe the hardest part of all is that you still miss them. But what you miss most is who you were before the distance existed. And you can't return to that version of yourself without returning to the pain that came with it. So, what do you do with this kind of grief? The kind that doesn't come from losing someone completely. The kind that comes from slowly realizing you can still love people and no longer fully belong in the same places you once did. You let it exist. You don't rush to replace the connection. You don't force yourself to stop caring. And you don't treat the loneliness like proof, that you made the wrong choice. You sit with it quietly, and after a while, you begin understanding something important. Grief is not always a sign that something was broken. Sometimes it's just evidence that something mattered deeply to you, that certain people shaped your life in real ways, that certain versions of yourself once felt safe there, and that letting go of those versions of yourself was never going to feel painless. Because change is complicated like that. You can miss people and still understand why you can no longer return to who you were with them. And maybe maturity is learning that both of those feelings can exist at the same time. You didn't become distant because you stopped caring. If anything, you started caring more about whether your presence felt honest, whether your silence actually meant something, whether the version of yourself people knew was still the version of yourself you could truthfully live as. And slowly, certain places stopped fitting the same way they once did. Not because the connection wasn't real, and not because the memories became less meaningful, but because you changed quietly over time. And eventually, the old shape of certain relationships could no longer hold the person you were becoming. That grief doesn't disappear all at once. After a while, it becomes lighter to carry. Not because you forget the people, but because you slowly build a life around the space they left behind. A life that feels more honest to who you are now. And maybe that's the part nobody tells you when you begin changing. You can love people deeply and still understand why you can no longer return to certain versions of yourself. That doesn't make the connection fake. It just means it belonged to a different time in your life. Carry that grief gently. It exists because something about those relationships once mattered to you deeply. And maybe maturity is learning that not every meaningful connection is meant to follow you forever. I'll see you in the quiet.